Good morning, everybody. This is a webinar presented by the Center for Future Consciousness, and I'm Tom Lombardo, the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. And the graphics today, at least a good number of them, are by Terry Spataro. And the topic of the webinar today, which is webinar 6 in the ongoing series of webinars on the future evolution of consciousness. The topic today is going to be reciprocity and consciousness. And two things I wanted to mention pertaining to this opening slide. Number one, I have a quote here that's something that we'll think about as we go through today. Consequently, he who wants to have right without wrong, order without disorder, does not understand the principles of heaven and earth. He does not know how things hang together. And I'm probably going to botch the pronunciation of his name, but Shuang Zhu. Now, perhaps I'm pronouncing it wrong, but I apologize. The other thing I wanted to note on this opening slide is this graphic. This is a graphic that I created a long time ago that I actually gave a title to. And the title I gave it was The Rings of Reciprocity. And as we go along today, I will explain the significance and the meaning of this graphic. But by the time we come to the end today, you hopefully will have an understanding of what this graphic is representing. I tell people when they come over to my home and they happen to see this graphic, this is my vision of the form of time. So, and it's going to have to definitely do with the idea of reciprocity. And as we go along, I will begin to explain what this graphic means. The webinar today, depending upon your own particular background and perspective, you might see it as highly philosophical, or you might see it as highly scientific. And I think, in a sense, it's both of those things. And we're going to be delving into a set of related topics dealing with the idea of reciprocity, including consciousness and the nature of reality and the nature of the cosmos as a whole, including human nature. So we're going to be covering reciprocity from a variety of different perspectives, philosophical, scientific, and psychological as we go along. Now, I should mention, just in case you're not aware of this, that this webinar series aligns with a series of book chapters in draft form, which are up on my website, the Center for Future Consciousness. And so you could see the initial drafts of the various topics that I've been going through in the webinar, and also up on my YouTube channel for the Center for Future Consciousness are all of the previous webinars that Terry has recorded, and the videos are all up there on the YouTube channel for the Center for Future Consciousness. So if you're interested in looking at any of them or reviewing any of them that you've participated in before, they're all there. And Terry's very good at this, and hopefully within a short period of time, the webinar today will be up on the YouTube channel as well. Now, what I normally do when I start a webinar is I do a very quick review of the previous webinar. In fact, I'm going to do a review of both webinars 4 and 5 since they were an integrated whole, the last two. And in those two webinars, I talked about the evolution of life. and the emergence of certain fundamental or basic psychological processes that are associated with consciousness, such as perception, self-awareness, purposeful behavior, emotion. I talked about the prehistoric evolution of humanity and the emergence of various technological and environmental creations that were empowered by future consciousness, such as tool making and artifacts and hunting and agriculture, etc. And I should mention that up on the chat box, there is an interesting new article that I just happened to read this morning on the prehistoric evolution of Homo sapiens, running back the last couple 100,000 years, that is up on the chat box that I found fascinating about why we ended up being the only species among a whole different set of different evolutionary lines in the hominid and Homo sapien evolutionary development. And then I talked about the emergence of civilization and successive civilizational revolutions. And I talked about the significance of purposeful evolution, that humanity has purposefully guided the evolution of human civilization. And it is able to do so because of it having the capacity for future consciousness. That is, to think ahead, to set goals, to plan, to purposefully direct the flow of events. That is, due to the fact that we have heightened future consciousness, we've been able to purposefully evolve both ourselves and civilization. I talked about various theories of the evolution of human consciousness, and then the big bulk at the end was I did an ongoing history of the evolution of consciousness and the concomitant evolution of future consciousness in paradigms of the future, from ancient mythology through classical times to modernity and up to contemporary reality, and finally the emergence of science fiction and future studies as two contemporary paradigms of future consciousness. So that was sort of a review of the last two webinars. And last time, Alan Chudnow mentioned to me this book, which I think is worth having a look at, that came out a few years ago on the history of humanity, in particular, the emergence of human civilization over the last 5 to 10,000 years, which has gotten a lot of attention. It's a very, it seems to be a very interesting book presenting an alternative view of how human civilization evolved and the significance of our modern notion of progress and of democratic institutions versus authoritarian institutions. And it has some novel ideas in it. And like I've mentioned before, history is continually being explored, articulated, rewritten, and this is a recent book that's contributing additionally into our understanding of history. And I think I mentioned, I know I did last time, that there are alternative views of the evolution of human history. And I mentioned Ryan Eisler's view as a counterbalance to the technological and material based meta theory of the evolution of civilization that we went through agricultural, industrial, information ages, with Eisler presenting an alternative. And this is another well researched and with very positive reviews of the history of humanity and human civilization, especially over the last 5 to 10,000 years. I haven't read the book, but I've read a number of reviews on it and it looks interesting. To further add into our understanding of how humans and human consciousness and human civilization evolved. But I also wanted to mention today that one of our regular participants, Debbie Alea, has come out with a new book on creative critical thinking for the passionate, right? That's it. Okay. A 12-week workshop. And this was Debbie's quick description of the book, a must read for anyone with a desire to think more clearly, to connect themselves with the larger world, or to improve decision making or mentor others in any field. So move from data to doing, avoid the avoidable, and bring out the best you. So this book has just recently come out, and I will soon have an opportunity to look at it. But as I mentioned, Debbie's been a regular participant, and this is her new book. There's a couple other new books I wanted to mention, which I won't right now, but perhaps next time that will also be of relevance to the general topic of the evolution of consciousness. But I didn't want to overload with recommendations today. So those two in particular, plus the article on prehistoric human evolution, are some books to mention as we further move along with this topic of the future evolution of consciousness. Now, as an outline for webinar 6, I spent the last 3 webinars talking about evolution and how evolution, as a basic principle of nature, applies to the historical development of humanity and the development of consciousness. Now, today I'm going to introduce a second key principle in understanding both the history and development of consciousness and the nature of consciousness. And that idea is reciprocity. I'm going to introduce it and begin to explain what reciprocity means through looking at different theories of dual consciousness, which has been a very pervasive theme in thinking about the nature of consciousness, that consciousness exhibits some kind of fundamental duality. And in particular, I'm going to look at the study of Eastern versus Western paradigms of consciousness. Then I'm going to explain how the Taoist Yin-Yang provides a fundamental archetypal model of the nature of reciprocity. And once I've explained this basic idea of reciprocity and how the Taoist Yin-Yang illuminates it, I'm going to apply the idea of reciprocity to a series of topics relevant to consciousness, beginning with how reciprocity gives us a basic principle for understanding the nature of open systems and how open systems as a fundamental concept applies to life, humanity, and the universe in general. And then I'm going to introduce the notion of reciprocal evolution that combines together the ideas of reciprocity with evolution and compare that with the concept I previously explained about purposeful evolution. So how do these two evolutionary processes work together? I'm going to focus in on ecological psychology, where the principle of reciprocity really helps us to understand the nature of our psychology, the nature of our consciousness, and how our psychology and consciousness is part of a ecological reality built up from various reciprocal realities. And then I'm going to do some comparison of reciprocity and dualism. And then I'm going to talk about reciprocity and epistemology. And epistemology is the study of knowledge. And how does reciprocity have some illuminating features to it regarding what it means to know? And then finally, I'm going to connect together reciprocity, evolution, and time. And that's when the rings of reciprocity will be explained in more depth and detail. So that's the sequence of topics for today, all of it revolving around this basic idea of reciprocity and how the concept of reciprocity helps us to understand what we are, who we are, how we fit together with the universe, and what consciousness is. So, to begin, as I mentioned, I talked for 3 weeks on evolution. Today, I'm going to add a second key principle, reciprocity. And the way I'm going to start it is by just noting that in the history of psychology, the history of philosophy, a very popular idea, which has taken many different forms, is that human consciousness actually consists of two complementary or different modes of consciousness. There has been the theory of right versus left cerebral hemisphere consciousness, the distinction made between consciousness embedded in words versus consciousness embedded in images. There's been the distinction that's been developed between feminine type consciousness and masculine type consciousness. There's been the distinction developed between holistic consciousness and analytic consciousness. And I'm only scratching the surface. And in fact, there are innumerable other dual theories of consciousness that have popped up. This is a common theme. And up here I have an image of the two cerebral hemispheres, one which is filled with colorful flowers, the right brain, the left side being circuitry, which is the analytic left side versus the artistic, holistic right side image there. Another one that I talked about, which I think is important too, was the history of romantic Dionysian consciousness versus Apollonian rational consciousness. So this is a theme that's been around for centuries. And what I'm going to do today is that I'm introduce a particular expression of this idea of dual consciousness. Richard Nisbett, who is a social psychologist, about 20 years ago, roughly, did a very extensive research program comparing how Eastern people think versus how Western people think. And he sampled different populations across the globe, not just one or two locations, but at least a half a dozen different locations. And he developed this theory of a fundamental difference between Eastern consciousness and Western consciousness. This is a statistical general difference. There are people in the East who think more like Westerners and people in the West who think more like Easterners. But as a general statistical difference, there was, in fact, some notable differences between Eastern and Western thinking. Now, a way to illuminate this, to see what this meant, is with a little story that Nisbet tells in the book, The Geography of Thought. He's talking with one of his graduate research assistants, who is a Korean. And the Korean student says to him, the difference between you and me is that you think reality is a line, where I think reality is a circle. And that grad student captured in that short little comment this fundamental difference in mindsets between at least how he saw the difference between Western and Eastern thinking as different paradigms of consciousness. The Eastern model of consciousness is that reality is like a circle. The Western view of Western mode of consciousness is that reality is more like a line. So, what does this mean? Well, here are the fundamental statistical differences that Nisbet teased out of hundreds, if not thousands, of tests and interviews between people across the globe. On the eastern side, think of reality as going in a circle. On the western side, reality moves like a line in a direction. In the East, the fundamental system of logic is the Tao. In the West, it's the syllogism. In the East, the Eastern mindset focuses on context. In the West, we tend more to focus on discrete objects. The East is more holistic, looking at the whole. The West is more analytic. Now, remember, these are just statistical differences. They are not absolute black and white differences. In the East, there's more of an emphasis on interdependency and community. In the West, there's more of an emphasis on individuality and autonomy. In the East, the fundamental principle is the golden mean, the middle way, and balance. And their logic is both and. In the West, the logic tends to be either or, one truth. It's either black or it's white. It's not both. This either or gets connected up with dualistic thinking of splitting reality into differences. It's either this or it's that. Now, again, these are statistical differences, but these appear to be two different paradigms, mental frameworks of consciousness that are expressive of Eastern versus Western thinking. Now, what's especially noticeable about this is that as you move from the Far East and head west across Asia into Europe and then into the Americas, there is this noticeable gradual shift from the Eastern model to the Western model. That is, this occurs in gradations. The most extreme form of the Eastern model or paradigm of consciousness is found in the Far East. The most extreme form of the Western model is found over here in North America. Now, when you look at these two different ways of thinking, you could see them as being oppositional. That is, do you think more Eastern or do you think more Western? Now, one of the goals today is going to be to show that even though there are these two different characteristic paradigms of consciousness that correspond to geographical cultural differences, there is a way to conceptualize it so these are not oppositional, but they're rather synthetic, to see them as a complementary pair of modes of consciousness. I should also mention that if people are transported and move from the east to the west, their thinking over time becomes more Western and vice versa. If they move from the west to the east, their paradigm of consciousness over time tends to become more Eastern. So this isn't something locked in to the human species. It seems to be a reflection of geography and culture, as opposed to something that's inherently biologically different between Eastern and Western human beings. So, what I would suggest is I would suggest that the Eastern mode of thinking that reality is like a circle going around and around and around, that is a expression of a view of reality that aligns with reciprocities. The Western view that reality is like a line aligns with the Western scientific theory of evolution. That is, what you see up here is you see up here this cultural and psychological inclination toward either seeing reality like reciprocities in the East or like an evolutionary progressive process like in the West, noting that the Taoist Yin-Yang comes out of China, Eastern, and the theory of evolution comes out of the West, comes out of English-speaking West. So that sets the stage. Two modes of consciousness, one that's more Eastern, one that's more Western. They seem to be different, even oppositional, but perhaps somehow they're actually complementary. And we'll move along with that. And they align with the ideas of reciprocity versus evolution. So, what does the term reciprocity mean? If you take out a dictionary, what you'll find is that reciprocity can get defined as a state or relationship of mutual exchange. A second definition of reciprocity, which I have encountered, in fact, this is the one I encountered first, is reciprocity means distinct but mutually supportive interdependent realities. And on those first two definitions, note that the term or the concept of mutuality is key to both definitions. Now, another way we can look at the idea of reciprocity would be to say, combining them, is that reciprocity means codependence of existence between two or more entities involving some kind of exchange between those entities. That sort of distills down what there is above there. But I should note that in the very definition of reciprocity are two apparent opposites: distinct, meaning separate, independent, and interdependent, meaning connected, meaning forming a whole. So, built into the very definition of reciprocity are these two apparent opposites. Now, sometimes reciprocity in the form of the term reciprocals can mean complementary as well. And complementary or complements means that what we have is a balanced and complete whole formed out of the complements. And I think that's another piece to the meaning of this idea that needs to be kept in mind. But even bringing that into it, we can end up with this kind of definition of reciprocity, which gets a bit long-winded. Mutually dependent relationship, which can involve a mutual exchange among distinctive entities that are complements to each other. So basically, the idea here is that the way to understand and describe reality is going to be that reality, in some sense, consists of distinct but mutually supportive interdependent realities. And built into that very definition is what appears to be an opposition, which how can two things that are distinct, two or more things, be interdependent with each other? But the two are actually combined in the very meaning of the term. And often associated with it, with this concept, is that there's some exchange going on, and also there's some sense in which what we mean by reciprocals are actually complementary, and that two reciprocals form a balanced and complete whole. Now, it seems to me that the archetypal early fundamental vision, image, expression, concept of this idea of reciprocity can be found in the Taoist Yin-Yang. And I have up here an image of the yin-yang. In case you do not know, the yang is the white side, the yin is the black side. Although notice that inside of the yin is the yang, and inside of the yang is the yin. The concept of the yin yang, from what I've been able to gather in my historical research, goes back at least to 1300 BCE, and Taoism, as the philosophy associated with the yin yang, goes back at least to 600 BCE. And the Taoist yin yang presents a both and logic of reality that contrasts with the either or logic of the West. That is, reality is not seen as independent dual opposites, but rather as mutual interdependent complements, in that the yin and the yang require each other for their existence. That is, without the yang, there is no yin. Without the yin, there is no yang. And even though they are distinct, they are also interdependent. Now, lots of different terms and ideas get associated with the yin and get associated with the yang. The yin has been described as the dark side, as the earth, as female, as passive, whereas yang has been seen as light, heaven, male, and active. So there's metaphorical associations with each of the two realities in Chinese history. But given this generalized model of reality, time is conceptualized as a balanced rhythmic oscillation, a cycle of dominance between yin and yang. Now, remember, I talked earlier in a previous webinar on the fact that our earliest notions of time seem to be predominantly time as a circle or a cycle, as a rhythmic oscillation. And the yin yang exemplifies this vision of time as a circle, as a cycle. So there's a oscillating dominance between the dark side or the yin and the light side or the yang. But not that the yin is in some way inferior, because the yin is absolutely necessary in order for there to be a yang. If you get rid of one, you get rid of the other one. Now, the Tao, if you look at the diagram of the yin yang, you'll notice that there is a sine wave that bifurcates the two, an oscillatory sine wave running down through the middle. The Tao has been described as the balance or the rhythm or the way of the yin and the yang. So as the yin and the yang oscillate, that oscillation, which is represented by the sine wave, that is the Tao. That is the rhythm of the oscillation. It's a balanced rhythm of the oscillation. Indeed, the Tao is the interface of the yin and the yang. And you could describe the Tao as the oneness of the two-ness. It is the interface, the border that both unites the yin and the yang. It is a invariant border for both the yin and the yang that form, but it also divides them. It's the division between the two. Now, I know I'm talking here about certain features of this diagram, but one thing to keep in mind here is that what we're going to enter into here is into a intuitive, visual understanding of the nature of reality. I'm putting it into words, but I'm asking you also to look at the diagram itself and notice certain features of it. So the Taoist Yin-Yang contains within it, in its visual embodiment, both two-ness, plurality, distinctiveness, yin and yang, but unity and interface, the Tao. And the Tao is the rhythm, the oscillation of the two complementary fundamental forces of reality. So this is a both and in the sense that without one, you don't have the other. But also notice that the oneness only exists because of the two-ness. That is, the oneness is the interface of the two as much as the two are the complements that make up the one. So in the diagram are the dimensions of both plurality and unity, the plurality of yin and yang and the unity of the Tao. And hence, plurality, that is the yin yang, and unity, the Tao, require each other. That is, the universe is a one because it is a many, and the universe is a many because it is a one. Now, that seems to go in a circle. Yes, exactly. And remember, Eastern mindset, reality is a circle. Western mindset, it's a line. So even though it looks as if, or it feels as if you're going around in a circle, indeed, that's the whole point. The logic here is a both and it is a circular form of thinking. And in fact, to really get your head spinning, notice that the definition of reciprocity is distinct, the many, and interdependency, the one and the whole. Those two terms are coupled together in the definition of reciprocity. But those two terms, distinct or pluralism and interdependency or oneness, themselves are a reciprocity. That is, you can't understand one without the other. So the very definition of reciprocity contains in it a reciprocity. In fact, the fundamental one, that is the complementarity of the one and the many. So this logic can seem a little disequilibrating, but as all of us know, the yin yang is one of the most popular visible icons across the globe. And when people look at it, they often get an intuitive sense as to what this means. Yes, reality is like that. You know, it's opposites. They're together. They go around in a circle. Life is this up and down yo-yo kind of effect. So the Western opposites of either or logic in the East, in the yin yang, are interdependent complements, both and. Now, even though people often jumped, I think, to the erroneous conclusions that the Taoist Yin-Yang is this versus that. The Taoist Yin-Yang is not this or that. It's both. That is, it rejects the dualisms of one versus many, order versus chaos, good versus evil, consciousness versus physical matter, pleasure versus pain. It rejects them in that it says each of those pairs are interdependent and require each other. You can't have one without the other. But it also rejects monism. Taoism is not saying, or this image here, by its very logic, is not saying that reality is fundamentally a whole, a one, because it's equally saying that reality is fundamentally a many. It's got to be both. So there's no unexplained explainer in the sense that here is the ultimate, because anything in reality which is a determinable reality has to be part of a reciprocity where there is something else which is required for its existence. That is, everything requires something else. There's nothing that stands alone, nothing that's foundational, because built into the very logic of it is that anything you might point out in reality is going to have its complement, which is necessary for that very reality to exist. Now, that may sound all very abstract, but now we could get more scientific and bring it a little bit more down to earth. And the place I'm going to start with is with the theory of open systems. And open systems is a very pervasive and popular concept that's developed across numerous areas of the study of nature, from the molecular to the chemical, biological, ecological, psychological, technological, all the way up to the solar galactic. And it's a key and central idea of regarding the nature of the entities that exist within the universe, within nature. Now, a system can be defined as a complex made up out of parts, dynamic in motion, and integrated, that is, the parts are in some way coordinated and organized together of diverse interactive parts. Now, the theory of open systems is that idea of a system has been applied across the board in nature. Now, there's a fundamental distinction that's made in systems theory between open and closed systems. A closed system is defined as any system which does not interact with its surround. It's closed off. And according to the second principle of thermodynamics, or the laws of entropy, any closed system will disintegrate if it doesn't interact with its surround. It will fall into chaos. Open systems interact with their surround and require interaction to maintain their integration, that is, their organization, and their distinctiveness, that is, their separateness from other systems. Open systems both affect their surround and are affected by it. That is, it is the nature of open systems that they interact with each other. But keep in mind, and here's the key point, if a system does not interact with its surround and it is closed, it falls apart. Hence, open systems require interaction in order to maintain their organized distinctiveness. So, in essence, all of the open systems in nature, from the molecular up to the galactic, are in states of reciprocity. That is, they are distinctive integrated systems that are complex, dynamic, and organized, that require interaction with their surround in order to maintain their individuated distinctiveness. So they require holistic, interactive interdependency to be separate. So here we are back to this apparent opposite combination of opposites between being interdependent and being distinct. But the argument here is that the systems of nature, as distinctive entities, cannot be distinctive entities unless they interact with other distinctive entities. So there's no inherent distinctiveness to anything without interdependency. But we're back to the reciprocity notion and the Taoist notion. I put up here my book, The Future of Science, Technology, and the Cosmos, because there's a very good, not very good, I shouldn't compliment myself. There's a very extensive, yes, Jean-Bert, right. Okay, there's a very extensive discussion of the idea of open systems and how they apply to different areas of scientific study in that book, The Future of Science, Technology, and the Cosmos. And thank you, Jambor, for putting your thumbs up. But Jambor, in fact, has read this book, and Jambor told me it was very good. So thank you, Jambor. Now, um, this idea is going to help us to illuminate another idea that's been a fundamental theme in human thought. As you recall, I mentioned nature seems to be organized as a hierarchical structure with more complex units integrating from simpler units. When we bring open systems in here, we realize that in fact, any set of parts, individuated parts, that together form into a more complex whole. Those individuated parts are open systems themselves. And when they integrate, they form into a bigger, more complex whole. But the bigger, more complex whole itself will be part of some even bigger, more complex whole. So Arthur Koestler, the scientist, philosopher, very popular thinker of the latter part of the 20th century, in Janus, proposed this idea that of a holarchy, not a hierarchy, a holarchy, where all of nature can be seen as a hierarchical structure of entities which are wholes relative to the parts that they are subsuming, but they are parts relative to bigger wholes. So everything in nature is both a whole and a part. That's the whole idea. Now, the parts depend on interaction of other parts in the whole to maintain their distinctiveness. But the whole depends on the collective interaction of the parts to maintain its integration. So wholes and parts, which are terms that are used in philosophical discourse, themselves are an example of a reciprocity. And what that simply means is that the whole depends upon the parts for its existence, but the parts depend upon the whole for their existence. It works both ways. So the idea that reality is either a holism or a pluralism is a misleading dichotomy because the whole determines the parts and the parts determine the whole. Reciprocity subsumes both in that, yes, the universe is a whole, but the universe is also a pluralism at the same time. And those two things are interdependent. Now, with everything in interaction, even though we may think in linear terms, that is, A causes B, which in turn causes C, which in turn causes D, it's important to note that actually the relationship between open systems also demonstrates a form of circular causality where everything is being affected by everything else and everything is affecting everything else. So if I look at two entities in nature, what I will notice is that there is a circular causality between the two, in that one is doing this to the other, while the other in turn is doing something back to it. So when we think of having impacts on nature, moving something and changing it, it's important to keep in mind that nature itself is all of these circular loops of interdependent causality. So whenever I do something to nature, that nature that I have done something to affects me back because it goes in circles. And open systems being inherently dynamic on one hand are also to a certain degree stable on the other hand. So in fact, a human body is an open system. It requires interaction with its surround. And it stays relatively stable over a certain period of time. But a human body is not inert because inside of a human body, there is an incredible amount of dynamic activity at multiple levels of its organization occurring. Now, it maintains its stability through rhythmic oscillations, which is that even though we find in the world things that look as if they are relatively stable, when we decompose them, we find that the reason why they are stable is because the processes within them go in circles. So they maintain a dynamic relative stability. But there's nothing that's absolutely stable because everything in nature demonstrates some form of dynamism. So we end up here with this idea that stability and change in nature are not really two distinct realities, but they in fact require each other. That is, things remain stable by oscillating, and change, when it occurs, always involves some relatively stable patterns constrained by a whole. Now, I'll go into that a little bit more, but the basic idea here is that if we look around us and we see things that are relatively stable, they are only relatively stable, but inherently they are very dynamic, except they are oscillatory. They go in circles. And if I look around and I see things changing, keep in mind that things that are changing within the constraints of the whole system that they are embedded in. So there's no absolute change, no absolute stability. They're interdependent, a reciprocity. Now, the idea of reciprocity also comes up in thinking about the earth and life with James Lovelock's theory of Gaia. Lovelock's theory of Gaia is that the living and non-living aspects of the earth are intertwined and interactive, generating a self-organizing, self-regulating system. That is, life and non-life, although they are distinct, the organic and inorganic, are actually a reciprocity. They are interactive with each other. Elizabeth Sahtouris refers to the Earth as a living planet. It's a planet, it's at some fundamental level, it consists of inorganic, but it also is alive at the same time. And indeed, the evolution of life has shaped the evolution of the Earth. That is, life infuses itself into the earth in various ways, and the earth is vastly different from the pre-life earth. And in fact, the earth, Gaia, has gone through stages of evolution and this process of interaction. Now, before I mention passive versus active adaptation, passive adaptation is when life changes or evolves in response to a transformative reality around it. That's the normal meaning that's usually given to adaptation, except in the Gaian theory, life creates and modifies and changes the earth in order to better support its own existence. That is, even though this might sound counterintuitive, but life creates resources and creates environmental support systems for its own existence because it actively adapts. It modifies its environment to better support its own existence. So this again is a reciprocity. Now, I also discuss the Gaian theory at length in my book, The Future of Science, Technology, and the Cosmos. Now, notice we're just finding reciprocity all over the place. Now we'll come to this form of reciprocity. Life is an immense plurality of separate individuals at any given time. This is a very romantic, idealized vision of the plurality of contemporary life out in the woods with deer, foxes, birds, badgers, and various other creatures there. Individual species do not exist as separate entities, but exist as part of a network of interdependent individual life systems, forms. We call those ecosystems. That is, they're not, even though these are distinct species and we do have distinct members, they are interdependent with each other and they form uh, uh, bigger systems of a pluralism of different living forms. Now, the bio network is transformative. So, this particular plurality up here that we see, this contemporary plurality of interdependent, distinctive life forms, has not been the same plurality throughout history. There have been mass extinctions and mass emergent evolutions. Um, these different species that we have up here require each other for their own existence. They do not exist in isolation from each other, and they evolve in interaction with each other. So, evolving in interaction with each other, that is, having coevolution, interdependent evolution, is an expression of reciprocity, but now in a dynamic form. And this I call reciprocal evolution. So, individual species do not evolve separately, they evolve in interaction and reciprocity with each other. So, if we jump back in time, here's a reconstructed ecosystem of 500 million years ago during the Cambrian period, a whole different set of interdependent life forms, including trilobites and various kinds of jellyfish and other strange looking creatures there, uh, roughly 500 million years ago. Here's a representative ecosystem of the Jurassic era, a different set of interdependent life forms, of dinosaurs, of giant flying reptiles, and actually a primitive mammal and a crocodile thrown into the picture as well. So this is a different network. And then even further along, here's a more recent a biological network of interdependent life forms during somewhere around, I think, 20 million years ago, when mammals grew in size and primates began to evolve. And the whole distribution, the whole collection is changed. So these are not separate species in the sense that they evolve independently, but they evolve reciprocally with each other. Now, some species do maintain themselves in relatively stable fashion across eras, like the crocodile, but the crocodile, in fact, has evolved in ways too. So, our network of life is a network of distinct but interdependent life forms that are involved in a process of reciprocal evolution. Now, if we turn to humanity, how does reciprocity and reciprocal evolution apply to us and apply to our very nature? Well, item number one, our biological body clearly exists in a state of reciprocity with the environment, including other living forms. That is, we both require the environment biologically in order to maintain our distinctive integrity, but we have an impact on the environment through our waste products and actions. We interact with our environment biologically. We produce an awful lot of waste impacting it, a lot of effects on the environment, but we're also at the same time dependent on it. So we can't think of ourselves as, you can piss in the water and it doesn't make any difference because it comes back at you. Our psychological reality exists in reciprocity with the environment, including other people in particular. So our psychological makeup, our basic psychological processes require an environment, especially a social environment, in which our consciousness, ourselves can thrive. Human society exists in reciprocity with the environment, including the earth. What societies do is both part of Gaia, part of the earth, and impacting the earth and being impacted by it. Human individuals exist in a state of reciprocity with society as a whole. As individuals, we impact the whole, but the whole impacts us. Indeed, at all these different levels, and I brought this up earlier when I talked about the evolution of human civilizations, there is interactive reciprocal evolution of all dimensions. The biopsychosocial Gaian dimensions are all transformative and are all concurrently evolving and concurrently interactive with each other. The Earth, in fact, exists in a holistic solar system. And even though it has a marginal effect upon the solar system as a whole, the solar system as a whole is an interactive and transformative evolutionary system. So, future humanity and consciousness is going to evolve as a interactive reciprocal evolution with a transformative environment. And in that regard, I came to the conclusion quite a while ago that the belief that one could possibly achieve some kind of harmonious, stable human environment relationship is totally unrealistic because it has never existed in nature. Nature is always in an interactive, dynamic process of being on the move, of change. There is relative stability in it, but it's never settled. It never comes to some harmonious balance. Even today, obviously, there's no balance. The whole idea of balance in nature, I think, is unrealistic because nature, although there's lots of complementary forces at work, they're always in a process of affecting and transforming each other. So, what's the relationship between reciprocal evolution and purposeful evolution? And I have a quote from Omar Khayyam, which I think sums it up. It's strange to tell among that earthen lot who is the potter, pray, and who is the pot. Meaning, of course, we see ourselves as the creator of the pot, as the potter, but the pot, in fact, shapes us as much as we shape the pot. Now, I mentioned active adaptation, which involves purposeful evolution. But I need to bring in now the purposeful evolution where we manipulate the environment, including ourselves, changes that environment, which has an effect upon us, often unintended. So we engage in purposeful actions to modify the environment. This is purposeful evolution, but those very actions generate different effects out there, which ripple out through the whole integrated ecological system and impact back on us, causing us to change in turn. So, as I brought up a long time ago in thinking about technology, we moan and groan about technology and its impact on us, but who creates these technologies? We do. And then we have to endure and adapt to the consequences of what we end up creating. And there's no way to avoid our environmental impact. Because we exist in the cosmos, we affect the cosmos. Now, purposeful technology changes the environment, but then again, purposeful technology plays back on humanity and changes us. And I brought up the idea for quite a number of years now, and um, this idea definitely can be found in Andy Clark's Natural Born Cyborgs, that we are, in fact, a functional synthesis and have been for a long time between the biological and the technological. That is, we're purposefully evolved cyborgs who exist in a technologically enhanced environment. So we, although creating technologies, use technologies to enhance and augment our psychological, social, and biological powers. We are functionally synthesizing with our technologies. And there would not be humanity without technologies, at least in our sense of humanity. So humanity and technologies are a reciprocity. We change the technologies, we create them, we're the potter, but the pot in turn, we require it in order to do whatever it is that we do. We're cyborgs. So humans exist in a reciprocity, a reciprocal evolution with our technologies. And so we are becoming more intertwined, more interactive. And I have up here a couple good books on technology. Um, Brian Arthur's The Nature of Technology, and published about the same time, Kevin Kelly's What Technology Wants. So that's a good place to stop for a 5-minute break, I think, on reciprocal and purposeful evolution and the connection between the two, illustrated most strongly in a relationship with technology where we purposively evolve it, but we reciprocally evolve with it because what we create ends up impacting back on us, causing us to do something else to keep up with the very creations that we're making. So why don't we sort of stop our recording for the start?